Welcome to each and everyone again to our Saturday class on 1 Corinthians. We're going to start with chapter 8, which is living by knowledge or by love. All right, would you read for us the first 3 verses?
Yes. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Now as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. And if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him.
All right, read that last part. If anyone, I'll read it. If anyone loves God, this one is known by him. All right. Having dealt with their questions about marriage and singleness, Paul now addresses in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 to 10 the next of their questions regarding eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. The meat offered on pagan altars was usually divided into 3 portions. One portion was burnt in honor of the god. One portion was given to the worshiper to take home and eat, and the third portion was given to the priest. If the priest didn't want to eat his portion, he sold it at the temple restaurant or meat market. The meat served and sold at the temple was generally cheaper. Then, as well as now, people loved a bargain, including Christians. Things offered to idols. The issue raised many questions for the Corinthian Christians. Can we eat meat purchased at the temple meat market? What if we are served meat purchased at the temple meat market when we're guests in someone's home? Can a Christian eat at the restaurant at the pagan temple? We know that we all have knowledge. Instead of talking about food, Paul first talks about the principles of knowledge and love. Christian behavior is founded on love, not knowledge. And the goal of the Christian life is not knowledge, but love. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies or builds you up spiritually. Both knowledge and love have an effect on our lives in that each of them makes something grow. The difference between puffs up and edifies is striking. It is the difference between a bubble and a building. Some Christians grow, others just swell. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, we think we know it all. We really don't know anything. Yet there is knowledge that is important. The knowledge God has of those who love him if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Verses 4 to 6.
Verses 4 to 6. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many. But to us, verse 6, but to us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him.
Because there's only one true God, idols are not competing gods. Idols are therefore nothing in the world and are only so-called gods. If meat is offered to Zeus, that's the name of one of their gods, there is no real Zeus. There is no other God but one. He is only one. He is only the only one of the so-called gods. There are many images that are supposed to be representations of divinities, but these divinities are nothing. The figments of mere fancy, and these images have no corresponding realities. As well, 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul calls Satan the god of this age. Certainly, he does not mean Satan is a true god, a rival god to the Lord God. Satan can be called the god of this age because he is regarded as a god by so many people. As there are many gods and many lords, refers to the so-called gods. Indeed, in the ancient world, there were many, many different gods, and even gods known as the unknown God, to cover any god one might have missed. That was found in Acts 17:23, when Paul was there and he said he saw a superscription to the unknown God. All right. And he said, this one that you don't know, I'm here to tell you about him. There is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. Paul isn't distinguishing Jesus from God as if Jesus were not God. When Paul calls Jesus Lord, he's using the Greek word kurios. And this word would have meant something to Bible reading people in Paul's day. Leon Morris on the word Lord. This term could be no more than a polite form of address like our sir, but it could also be used of the deity one worships. The really significant background, though, is its use in the Greek translation of the Old Testament to render the divine name Yahweh. Christians who use this as their Bible would be familiar with the term as equivalent to deity. Certainly, no one can say, through whom are all things and through whom we live, of any other than God himself. The Corinthian Christians may have reasoned like this: if idols are really nothing, it must mean nothing to eat meat sacrificed to nothing idols. And it must mean nothing to eat in the buildings used to worship these nothing idols. In the following section, Paul will show them a better way. That is acting on the principle of love. Verse 7. Would you read that for us?
Verse 7, howbeit there is not in every man that knowledge, For some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled.
There's not in everyone that knowledge. The Corinthian Christians who felt free to eat at the pagan temple may have based their freedom on correct knowledge, knowing that the idols are nothing. But for some, they have consciousness of the idol and they eat meat sacrificed to the idol as a thing offered to an idol. Paul asks the Corinthian Christians who know there's nothing to an idol to remember that not everyone knows this. If someone believes there's something to an idol and they eat the meat that's been sacrificed to an idol, their conscience being weak is defiled. Why is their conscience considered weak? Not because their conscience doesn't work. Indeed, it does work. In fact, it overworks. Their conscience is considered weak because it is wrongly informed. Their conscience is operating on the idea that there really is something to an idol. Their conscience being weak is defiled. You can imagine the free Corinthian Christians with their superior knowledge saying, but we're right. And in this case, being right is important, but is not more important than showing love to the family of God. Verse 8. What we eat or do not eat does not make us more spiritual. Would you read for us verse 8?
Okay, verse 8. But meat commanded us not to God, for neither. If we eat, are we the better? Neither. If we eat not, are we the worse?
Food does not commend us to God. You aren't more spiritual if you know idols are nothing and feel a personal freedom to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Neither, if we eat, are we the better. In Acts 15:29, the Jerusalem council sent a letter commanding some churches to, among other things, abstain from things offered to idols. But Paul's discussion of the issue here does not contradict what the Jerusalem council decided in Acts 15. Instead, it shows that the council's decision was not intended to regulate all the church all the time. It was a temporary arrangement meant to advance the cause of the gospel among the Jews of that day. Food does not commend us to God. On the other hand, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. No one is less spiritual for abstaining from meat sacrificed to idols. This is the very point where most stumble in issues relevant to Christian liberty, such as movies, drinking, music, or television. They assume that one stance or another is evidence of greater or lesser spirituality. Actually, when we get to, which we won't today, I don't think, but in chapter 10, there it shows us that when you eat food offered to idols, it's not an idol, but it is demons that you're offering it to. And once you see it in the spiritual context, you don't want to eat it. because that's why God says, don't eat it, because it's not offered to God. It's really behind that idol. What is there is demonic power. All right. This is the very point. Yeah. Okay, 9 to 13. What does matter? Love towards those in God's family.
9 to 13. But take heed, lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. Verse 10. For if any man see thee, which has knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be embroidered to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, from whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. Verse 13. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh, while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend.
A Corinthian Christian with superior knowledge might feel the personal liberty to eat meat sacrificed to idols. But is he exercising this liberty in a way that becomes a stumbling block? Paul says, you Corinthian Christians who say you have knowledge are claiming your rights. What about the rights of the weak brother? Because of your knowledge, shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died? God hath not given people knowledge that they thereby should be a means to harm and to destroy, but to do good and to save others. It is a most absurd thing for anyone to use their knowledge, therefore, to the destruction of others. Why is the brother who will not eat the meat sacrificed to an idol considered weak? Many Christians would consider that one to be the stronger Christian. However, Paul is not speaking about being weak or strong in regard to self-control, but in regard to knowledge. To influence the weak brother to go against his conscience and thereby wound their weak conscience is actually to sin against Christ. The Corinthian Christians who abuse their liberty might have thought it was a small matter to offend their weak brothers, but they did not understand that they offended Jesus Christ. In doing so, they were actually building up their brother to sin. And bolding comes from the words build up. Their misuse of liberty was building others up towards sin. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, Paul makes the principle clear. Our actions can never be based on what we know to be right for ourselves. We also need to consider what is right towards our brothers and sisters in Jesus. It is easy for a Christian to say, I answer to God and God alone, and to ignore his brother or sister. It is true, we will answer to God and God alone, but we will answer to God for how we have treated our brother or sister. Lest I make my brother stumble. At the same time, the issue is making a brother stumble, and stumble over an issue that has direct relevance to the brother in question. Paul would never allow this principle to be a way for a legalist to make demands and bind a Christian walking in liberty. In Galatians 2, Paul describes a situation where Peter made Gentiles think they had to come under Jewish customs and laws to be saved. Peter did this through his association and approval of some legalists. Paul rebuked Peter strongly because of this. Even if the legalists from a Jewish background had said to the Gentiles, "Your lack of obedience to our customs stumbles us. We are stumbled brothers. You must do what we want." Paul would have replied, "You are not stumbled because you aren't being tempted to sin through their actions. Your legalism is being offended. Out of love, I will never act in a way that might tempt you to sin, but I don't care at all about offending your legalism. In fact, I'm happy to do it." Many persons cover a spirit of envy and uncharitableness with the name of godly zeal and tender concern for the salvation of others. They find fault with all. Their spirit is a spirit of universal censoriousness. None can please them. Everyone suffers by them. These destroy more souls by tithing mint and cumin than others do by neglecting the weightier matters of the law. Such persons have what is termed, and very properly too, sour godliness. All right, now give me time. We're going to move to the next. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians 9. The rights of an apostle. Paul declares his rights as an apostle, verses 1 and 2. Paul is defending his status as an apostle. Would you read that for us? 1 Corinthians 9, verses 1 and 2.
1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? Verse 2. If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you, for the seal of my apostleship are ye in the Lord.
Remember the context. Paul addresses the Corinthian Christians about their right, based on knowledge, to eat meat sacrificed to idols in a temple restaurant. Paul asks them to let go of their right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, even as he has let go of his rights as an apostle. But Paul will also use the occasion to defend his apostolic position before the doubting Corinthian Christians. Am I not an apostle? Such an obvious truth could hardly need stating. Of course, Paul was an apostle. As obvious as this was, it was doubted and denied by some of the Christians in Corinth. Am I not an apostle? The evidence of Paul's true status as an apostle is shown in the following statements. Am I not free? Paul was not under authority to anyone but Jesus Christ, but other Christians were under apostolic authority. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Paul insists he did not merely see a vision of Jesus, but an authentic appearance of the post-resurrection Jesus. Are you not my work in the Lord? The proof is in the pudding. The work of God among the Corinthian Christians was evidence enough of Paul's apostolic credentials. In fact, they were the seal of Paul's apostleship in the Lord. Some today, because of visions or experiences they claim to have had, claim to be apostles on the level of Paul. But seeing the resurrected Jesus is not the only qualification of a true apostle. Paul was specifically commissioned as an apostle when Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus road, when he said, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? If I am not an apostle to other, yet doubtless I am to you. Although some among the Corinthian Christians did doubt Paul's standing as an apostle, they shouldn't have. The Corinthian Christians had more reason than most to know Paul was a genuine apostle because they had seen his work up close. This makes the doubt among the Corinthian Christians all the more ironic. And Paul is trying to make them aware of this irony. Verses 3 to 6.
Verses 3 to 6. My answer to them that do examine me is this: have we no power to eat and to drink? Have we no power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? Or Ione and Barnabas, have not we power to forbear working?
Paul will now assert his rights as an apostle, as if he were a lawyer arguing a case. The words defense, apologia, and examine, anakrino, are both legal words taken from the Roman law court. Paul feels like he's on trial, or that he has already been found guilty by the Corinthian Christians. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Paul, like all the apostles, had the right to eat and drink. It wasn't that the Corinthian Christians questioned Paul's right to eat, but Paul means that he has the right to eat and drink at the expense of the churches that he served. Do we have no right to take along a wife? Paul, like all the apostles, had the right to take along a wife. Again, the Corinthian Christians would not mind him taking along a wife as long as they did not have to support the apostle and his wife. But Paul makes it clear that he had the right to expect support for not only himself, but for his family also. as do the other apostles. Apparently, most of the other apostles were married, and their wives traveled with them as they did ministry. This is especially interesting concerning Peter, or Cephas, who was obviously married, yet still considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be the first pope, in contradiction to the principle of mandatory celibacy. In other words, the Roman Catholics say that, they're priests, and out of the priest will come one who is the pope. And they claim that Peter is the first pope, and yet they demand celibacy, which means they cannot get married. They are to remain single, and yet their first pope that they claim was Peter, he was married and had a wife. Or is it only Barnabas and I? Most of the other apostles received support from the churches they ministered to. Paul and Barnabas were unique in this regard, choosing to work and support themselves so no one could accuse them of preaching for a money motive. We might think this would make Paul and Barnabas more respected in the sight of the Corinthian Christians, but curiously, it made them less respected. It was almost as if the Corinthian Christians said, if Paul and Barnabas were real apostles, we would support them. But since they are not supported, we suppose they aren't real apostles. Verses 7 to 14. Why Paul has the right to be supported by those he ministers to. Would you read those verses to us?
Verse 7. Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planted a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or said not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses that thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doeth God take care for oxen? Or said he eat altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt this is written, for he that ploweth should plow in hope, and that he that treadeth in hope should be partaker of his hope. Verse 11. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? In others be partakers of this power over you. Are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do we not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Verse 14. Even so had the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel.
In an army, the soldiers are supported. The farmer is fed by the field he works in. The shepherd is supported by the sheep he cares for. Therefore, it should not seem strange to the Corinthian Christians that Paul has the right to be supported by the people he ministers to. Paul's right is also stated in the Mosaic law. He appeals to Scripture not only human illustrations. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, would you read that?
Sorry, Sister Seaward, the verse again.
Deuteronomy 25, verse 4.
Okay, 25, verse 4. Sorry, give me a moment. Okay, verse 4. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn.
This law simply commanded the humane treatment of a working animal. In those days, grain was broken away from its husk by an ox walking on it repeatedly, usually in a circle. It was cruel to force the ox to walk over all that grain, yet to muzzle him so he couldn't eat of it. Is it oxen God is concerned about? The principle of Deuteronomy 25:4 is much more important than providing for the needs of oxen. God establishes the principle that a minister has the right to be supported by the people he is ministering to. As one commentator said, since oxen cannot read, this verse was not written for them. The law about oxen stated a principle that had greater application. However, we must not make the mistake of thinking that Paul means to explain that commandment allegorically. For some, all right. He that plows should plow in hope. It would be cruel to starve those who are providing and preparing your food. To do so would take away all their hope. It makes them feel abused and unappreciated. Paul here makes it plain that it is right for the spiritual work of God's ministers to be repaid with material support of the people they minister unto. It wasn't that the Corinthian Christians refused to support anyone in ministry. No, others are partakers of this right. The problem of the Corinthian Christians was they refused to support Paul and thought less of him because he did not receive it. Just as strongly as Paul affirms his right to be supported by the people he ministers unto, he will also affirm his right to not use that right if using it might hinder the gospel of Christ. Here we see Paul's real heart. Paid or not paid, it did not matter to him. What mattered was the work of the gospel. Was it more effective for the gospel if Paul should receive support? Then he would receive it. Was it more effective for the gospel if Paul should work to support himself? Then he would do that. What mattered was that the gospel not be hindered in any way. If Paul was willing to deny himself such an important right for the good of the gospel and the Corinthian Christians, Then should not also the Corinthian Christians deny their right to eat meat sacrificed to idols for the same good? The Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. This summary statement is conclusive. Some might say, yes, the apostles had the right to be paid, but no one today has that right. But this command from the Lord means that anyone who preaches the gospel has the right to be supported by those he preaches to. Should modern ministers assert or release their right to be supported, they should do whichever will serve the gospel and the church better. But if a minister does take money for support, he should work hard to earn that money. If a man who does not labor takes his maintenance from the church of God, it is not only a domestic theft, but a sacrilege. He that gives up his time to this labor has a right to the support of himself and his family. He who takes more than is sufficient for this purpose is a covetous hireling. He who does nothing for the cause of God and religion and yet obliges the church to support him and minister to his idleness, irregularities, luxury, avarice, and ambition this is Clark saying it, is a monster for whom the human language has not yet got a name. The Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. We have no record of those specific words of Jesus, but in two places he states the principle. I'll just read it. Matthew 10:10, for a worker is worthy of his food. And Luke 10:8, whatever city you enter and they receive you not, eat such things as are set before you. Paul's desire to leave his rights unclaimed, verse 15 to 18.
Verse 15. But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be done so unto me. For it were better for me to die, than that any man should make my glory void. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do these things willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. Verse 18. What is my reward then? Verily that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel.
Paul had the right to be supported, but he did not use that right. In writing this, Paul was not hinting for support by the Corinthian Christians. He shows them the value and the reasons for giving up one's own rights. It would be better for me to die than anyone make my glorying or boasting void. Paul's boasting wasn't that he preached the gospel. He had to do that, for necessity is laid upon me. Instead, his glorying or boasting was that he was able to do it without asking his hearers for support. Remember that Greek culture, which the Corinthian Christians approve so much, looked down its nose on all manual labor, even though the Corinthian Christians seemed to think less of Paul because he worked with his own hands to support himself. It did not embarrass Paul at all. He will boast about it. Paul's ministry was not just a matter of choice or personal ambition. It was something he was called to, something he had to do. He did not just have preacher's itch. He was called to preach and felt compelled to fulfill that call. Woe is me if I preach not the gospel. If I do this willingly, some are not supported by the ministry, but it has nothing to do with choice. It is just because of their circumstances. But if one does not receive support willingly, then they have a reward. However, if it is against my will that I am not supported, then I have been entrusted with a stewardship. I may present the gospel of Christ without charge. In Paul's day, there were a lot of religious entrepreneurs who were out to preach any message to get money. Paul was happy to distance himself from these by never taking an offering, so no one would think he might abuse his authority in the gospel. This was Paul's reward. We may not ever be faced with the same decision Paul faced, to accept or deny support for the good of the gospel, but we each have a critical question to answer. What rights are you willing to sacrifice for the cause of Christ? Verses 19 to 23.
Verses 19. For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. Verse 20. And unto the Jews I become as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews to them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. Verse 21. To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. Verse 22. To the weak became I as weak, that I may gain the weak. I am make all things to all men, that I might be all means save some. Verse 23. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partakers thereof with you.
Paul was free to do what he wanted, but bringing people to Jesus was more important to him than using his freedom selfishly. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To outside observers, it might have looked like Paul's life was inconsistent, but he consistently pursued one goal: to win people to Jesus. In Acts 21, verse 23 to 26, Paul participated in Jewish purification ceremonies, which he knew were not necessary for his own life, but he hoped would help build a bridge of ministry to the Jews. As well, in Acts 16:3, Paul had Timothy circumcised, again, not because it was necessary, but because it could be helpful in getting ministry done among the Jews. To the Gentiles, he behaved himself as if he himself had been a Gentile, that is, forbearing the observations of the Levitical law, to which the Gentiles had never any obligation at all. Paul sought to win people to Jesus Christ by being sensitive to their needs and identifying with them. We should try to reach people where they are today and expect to see changes later. We should not think Paul changed his doctrine or message to appeal to different groups. He denied this in 1 Corinthians 1:22-23. Would you read that to us, since we don't remember it?
1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22-23. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified unto the Jews, a stumbling block, and unto Jews foolishness.
So he denies this in that 1 Corinthians 1:22-23, but he would change his behavior and manner of approach. This passage has often been looked to for the idea of accommodation in evangelism, that is, of adapting the message to the language and perspective of the recipients. Unfortunately, despite the need for that discussion to be carried on, this passage does not speak directly to it. This has to do with how one lives or behaves among those whom he wishes to evangelize. Let those who plead for the system of accommodation on the example of Paul attend to the end he had in view, the manner in which he pursued that end. It was not to get money, influence, or honor, but to save souls. It was not to get ease, but to increase his labors. It was not to save his life, but rather that it should be a sacrifice for the good of immortal souls. Now, this I do for the gospel's sake. Paul was willing to offend people over the gospel, but he wanted to offend them only over the gospel. I think we will stop here, and we will come back at 5 minutes past 10 and start with verses 24-27.
You need to turn on the video. Right.
Okay, we'll come back for our second half, second session. We are going to start with, we're on 1 Corinthians 9, and we'll be reading 24 to 27. This is Paul's attitude, is an athlete's attitude.
Okay, can I read now, Sister Seaward?
Yes, please.
Okay, verse 24. Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receive a prize. So run that ye may obtain. Verse 25. And every man that strive for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we are an incorruptible. Verse 26. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that which beateth the air. Verse 27. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway.
Sporting events were big in Paul's day as well as in our own. This was especially meaningful to the Corinthians because their city was the center for the Isthmian Games, second in prestige to the ancient Olympics. Paul often used figures from arena competition, at least 12 different references in his letters, including examples of runners, boxers, gladiators, chariot racers, and trophies. Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Paul tells us to train and compete as athletes who really want to win. Without effort, nothing can be won in a sporting event. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. To compete as an athlete, one must be temperate. The term refers to the manner in which Roman athletes had to train for 10 months before being allowed in the games. An athlete must refuse things that may be fine in themselves, but will hinder the pursuit of his goal. Even so, the Corinthians must refuse things that are fine in themselves, like meat sacrificed to idols, because having them may hinder the pursuit of the important goal, an imperishable crown, a heavenly reward that will never pass away. I discipline my body. Discipline is a weak translation. The ancient Greek word means to strike under the eye, to give a black eye. Paul didn't want his body to lord it over his entire being. Bring it into subjection literally means to lead about as a slave. Paul made sure that his body was the servant and his inner man was the master. The desires of his body were not going to rule over his entire self. But Paul did not think the body itself was evil. After all, it belongs to Jesus. Nor would he agree with later ascetics who punished their bodies in a quest for super holiness. Through the centuries, Christians known as flagellants would literally whip, beat, and torture themselves in a misguided attempt to fulfill this verse. Usually these Christians thought they could pay for their sins through such self-torture, and they refused to recognize that Jesus paid all the penalty of their sin. Lest when I have preached to others, Paul sees himself as both a herald of the games who announce the rules and as a participant. Paul told others the rules of the game, and he had to follow the rules himself. Preached refers to the office of the herald at these games, whose business it was to proclaim the conditions of the games, display the prizes, exhort the combatants, excite the emulation of those who were to contend, declare the terms of each contest, pronounce the names of the victors, and put the crown on their heads. Lest I myself should become disqualified. In this text, disqualified in this context, disqualified probably doesn't refer to the loss of salvation. No Greek citizenship was revoked upon losing, but the loss of reward. Disqualified signifies such a person as the judges of the games reject as having deserved the prize. So Paul himself might be rejected by the great judge. And to prevent this, he ran, he contended, he denied himself, and brought his body into subjection to his spirit, and had his spirit governed by the Spirit of God. Okay, we're now going to start 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 33. Idolatry then and now, verses 1 to 5. Israel's bad example.
Verses 1 to 5. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. Verse 2. And we were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat. Verse 4. And did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness.
1 Corinthians 10 carries on the subject introduced in 1 Corinthians 8 and continued in chapter 9, or what should the Corinthian Christians think and do in regard to meat which has been sacrificed to idols. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul established two principles. First, an idol really is nothing, and it was fine for Corinthian Christians who understood this to act according to this knowledge in regard to themselves. Second, for Christians, love is more important than knowledge. Even though I may know eating meat sacrificed to an idol is all right for myself, if it causes my brother to stumble, I won't do it, because it isn't the loving thing to do. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul showed how important it is for Christians to give up their rights, just as Paul gave up his right to be supported by his own preaching of the gospel. So some of the Corinthian Christians must sometimes give up their right to eat meat sacrificed to idols based on the principle of love towards a weaker brother. In the end of chapter 9, Paul showed how a Christian must be willing to give up some things, even good things, for the sake of winning the race God has set before us. Otherwise, we will become disqualified in the competition of the Christian life. I do not want you unaware that all are fathers. Paul wrote about the need to finish what God had set before us, how dangerous it is to refuse to give up something that gets in the way of finishing. Now he will use Israel's experience in the Exodus from Egypt to illustrate this principle. All our fathers, think of all the blessings Israel had in the Exodus from Egypt. The cloud of Shekinah glory overshadowed Israel throughout their journey from Egypt to the promised land. During the day, the cloud sheltered them from the brutal desert sun, and during the night, it burned as a pillar of fire. It was a constant, ready reminder of God's glory and presence. So all our fathers passed through the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses. All Israel came through the Red Sea and saw God's incredible power in holding up the walls of the sea so they could cross over on dry ground. Then they saw God send the water back to drown the Egyptian army. This was not only an amazing demonstration of God's love and power, but also a picture of baptism. By passing through the water, all of Israel was identified with Moses, even as by passing through water, a Christian is identified with Jesus Christ. All right, for that, it's Romans 6:3 and 4 to show that a Christian is being identified with Jesus through baptism. Would you read Romans 6:3 and 4?
Romans 6, verse 3 and 4. Know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Verse 4. Therefore we are buried with him by baptism unto death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life.
Yeah. So what this man is saying is that Israel was going through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses. But we as Christians are identified with Jesus Christ through baptism. All ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. All of Israel was sustained by God's miraculous provision of food and drink during their time in the wilderness. This was a remarkable display of God's love and power for Israel and a prefiguring of the spiritual food and drink that we receive at the Lord's table now. Israel even had ancient versions of the two Christian sacraments we receive to this day, baptism and communion. The word sacrament was used for the oath of allegiance that soldiers of the Roman legion took to their emperor. The early Christians considered communion and baptism to be an oath of allegiance unto Jesus Christ. Now, I just want to show you something that actually these notes that I'm reading from doesn't, when it talks about all, if you count all the alls, there are 5, which is the number of grace. And, you know, even though they had all tasted of the grace of God, yet with some of them, he was not pleased, all right? Israel even had the presence of Jesus Christ with them in the wilderness. Here, in identifying the rock that followed them, Paul builds on a rabbinical tradition that said Israel was supplied with water by the same rock all through the wilderness, a rock that followed them. Some Bible scholars today debate as to if the rock followed Israel or if the water followed Israel as in a stream. The point is the same. Jesus Christ was present with Israel in the wilderness, providing for their needs miraculously. What a blessing and what a privilege. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, despite all these blessings and spiritual privileges. The Israelites in the wilderness did not please God. In light of all these blessings, gratitude should have made them more pleasing to God, but they were not. Most of them, this is a hard-hitting understatement, only 2 men from the adult generation that left Egypt came into the promised land, Joshua and Caleb. For their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. The displeasure of God with the Israelites was evident because they never entered into the promised land, but died in the wilderness instead. For all their blessings and spiritual experiences, they never entered into what God really had for them. With most of them, God was not well pleased. Paul's point hits hard. The Corinthian Christians were probably taking all sorts of liberties, like feasting in pagan temples, stumbling their brothers, thinking that they were safe because of past blessings and spiritual experiences, especially baptism and communion. So Paul warns them to beware, because just as Israel was blessed and had spiritual experiences, they still perished. And so some of the Corinthian Christians might also. It seems as if the Corinthians had supposed that they're being made partakers of the ordinances of the gospel, such as baptism and the Lord's Supper, would secure their salvation. Notwithstanding, they might be found partaking of idolatrous feasts as long, at least, as they considered an idol to be nothing in the world. 6 to 10, avoiding Israel's bad example.
Verse 6. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lust. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Verse 9. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Verse 10. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer.
Now these things became our examples. We can and should learn from Israel's failure in the wilderness. How did Israel fail? They failed in that they could not say no to their desires. So we must not lust after evil things as they also lusted. The Corinthian Christians who insisted on eating meat sacrificed to idols, even though they led other Christians into sin, just couldn't say no. They said the meat is so good, or it is such a bargain, but they could not say no out of love for God and love for a brother. Do not become idolaters as some of them. Israel failed to keep their focus on God, and they started giving themselves to idolatry. Like it tells us in Exodus 32, 1 to 6, and Numbers 25, 1 to 3. Some of the Corinthian Christians not only got too close in their association with idols, they also made an idol out of their own knowledge and their own rights. Let's not commit sexual immorality or fornication as some of them did. Israel, in their idolatry, surrendered to the temptation of sexual immorality. They rose up to play is a tasteful way to refer to gross immorality among the people of Israel. We know that the Corinthian Christians were having trouble with sexual immorality, and the context here suggests it is connected with their selfish desire to please themselves, expressed in insisting on the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols. The verb translated play suggests sex play in Hebrew, and therefore we are probably to understand drunken orgies. In one day, 23,000 fell. This number presents some difficulty. The quotation from Exodus 32:6 sets the context there. And in Exodus 32:28 tells us about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. perhaps there were more that died, which the scriptures do not record, or there were 20,000 women who died in the aftermath of the golden calf incident, or some think Paul has jumped ahead to another time when Israel's sexual immorality during the Exodus brought God's judgment on them. In the Numbers passage, we are told that 24,000 died from the judgment of God, but perhaps it was 23,000 who died in one day. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain. Numbers 21, 4-9 describes the incident where, in response to the complaining of the people, God sent fiery serpents among the people. Again, their complaining hearts showed them to be self-focused and more concerned with their own desires than God's glory. The same issues causing trouble with the Corinthian Christians who will not yield their right to eat meat sacrificed to idols for the sake of another brother. They were destroyed by the destroyer because of the warning in 1 Corinthians 10, 1-5. It seems the Corinthian Christians believed they were safe from the danger of being destroyed, as the Israelites were destroyed because of past spiritual experiences and accomplishments. But Paul's warning stands: if it happened to Israel, it can happen to you. Be on guard. The Corinthian Christians seemed to have regarded this issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols, and therefore stumbling their brother, as a small issue. Paul wants them and us to know that it reflects a selfish, self-focused heart, which is the kind of heart God destroyed among the Israelites in the wilderness. It may have been a relatively small symptom, but it was a symptom of a great and dangerous disease. Verses 11-13.
Verse 11. Now all these things happen unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. Verse 13. There had no temptation taken you, but such as is common to men. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it.
All these things happen to them for examples, since we are those upon whom the ends of the ages have come. We can and should take warning from the bad example of Israel. We have a greater responsibility because we can learn from Israel's mistakes. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. For the Corinthian Christians to resist the temptation to be selfish and self-focused, they must first understand they are vulnerable. The one who thinks he stands will not stay on guard against temptation, so he may easily fall. Temptation works like rocks in a harbor. When the tide is low, everyone sees the danger and avoids it. But Satan's strategy in temptation is to raise the tide, to cover over the dangers of temptation. Then he likes to crash you upon the covered rocks. The highest saint under heaven can stand no longer than he depends on God and continues in the obedience of faith. He that ceases to do so will fall into sin and get a darkened understanding and a hardened heart. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. We often want to excuse our particular tempting circumstances as very unique and a special exception. But God here reminds us that our temptation is not unique. Many other men and women of God have faced the same or similar temptation and have found the strength in God to overcome the temptation. Others before you have found strength in the Lord to overcome your same temptation and worse. So you can be victorious in the strength of Jesus, not in your own strength. We fight temptation with Jesus' power, like the girl who explained what she did when Satan came with temptation at the door of her heart. I send Jesus to answer the door. When Satan sees Jesus, he said, whoops, sorry, I must have the wrong house. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. God has promised to supervise all temptation that comes at us through the world, the flesh, or the devil. He promises to limit it according to our capability to endure it. According to our capability as we rely on him, not our capability as we rely on ourselves. Satan would destroy us in a minute if God would let him, even as he wanted to destroy Job and Peter. But God will not let him. Like a mom who keeps her child from the candy aisle in a store, knowing the child couldn't handle that temptation, God keeps us from things we can't handle. But what we can and can't handle changes over the years. Why? Because we should be becoming more like Jesus and therefore able to trust him for more and able to overcome the temptation. The way of escape isn't the same as mere relief from the pressure temptation, which some people find by giving into the temptation. There's often a wrong way to relieve a temptation, and we will often face the same temptations over and over again until we show Satan and our flesh we are able to bear it. Barclay, who is a commentator, says the word for a way of escape is really a mountain pass, with the idea of an army being surrounded by the enemy and then suddenly seeing an escape route to safety, like a mountain pass. The way of escape isn't necessarily an easy way. The way of escape does not lead us to a place where we escape all temptation. That is heaven alone. The way of escape leads us to the place where we may be able to bear it. We are reminded that to be tempted is not sin, but to entertain temptation or surrender to temptation is sin. When we bear temptation, Satan often condemns us for being tempted, but that is condemnation from Satan, and the Christian does not need to accept it. At a market, a little boy standing by some candy looked like he was going to put some in his pocket and walk out the door. A clerk watched the boy for a long time and finally spoke to him. "Looks like you're trying to take some candy," the clerk said. The boy replied, "You're wrong, mister. I'm trying not to." For the time being, he was able to bear it. Back to the issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols. What about eating in the restaurant of a pagan temple? The principle stated, flee from idolatry. Verse 14, read for us, please.
Verse 14. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry.
In the original language, there is an article before idolatry, literally saying the idolatry. Paul is specifically referring to the idolatry at pagan temples. Though the Corinthian Christians may have the liberty to buy meat at the pagan temple butcher shop and prepare it in their own homes, they should flee from idolatry in regards to the restaurant of the pagan temple, using the example of Israel and their lapse into idolatry. Paul tells the Corinthian Christians not to participate in dinners served at the pagan temple. Verse 15 to 22.
Verse 15. I speak as to wise men, judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body. For we are all partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh. Are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then? That idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything. But I say, verse 20, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Verse 21, Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Verse 22. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we strong than he? Are we stronger than he?
Since the Corinthian Christians tended to pride themselves on their wisdom, he says, I speak as to wise men. Paul challenges them, if they are truly wise, to consider carefully what he says here. The cup of blessing are not those that eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar. Paul's point may seem obscure to us, but it was plain to someone in the ancient culture. Just as the Christian practice of communion speaks of unity and fellowship with Jesus, so these pagan banquets given in honor of idols spoke of unity with demons who took advantage of misdirected worship. To eat at a pagan temple banquet was to have fellowship at the altar of idols. The word partakers is the same word, koinonia, for communion in 1 Corinthians 10:16 and fellowship in 1 Corinthians 10:20. It's the very same word that's used there, koinonia. In the thinking of that part of ancient world, to eat at the same table as someone indicated friendship and fellowship with that person. Since you ate of one bread that made you one body, because you both shared of the same food at the same table. So to eat at the table of a pagan temple restaurant was not as innocent as it seemed. The cup of blessing was the last cup presented in the Passover ceremony. This was the cup that Jesus blessed at the Last Supper, and the one interpreted as a new covenant in my blood. When early Christians took communion, they were aware of its connection to Passover and with the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples. What am I saying then? The idol is anything, or that which is offered to idols is anything. They sacrifice to demons. Paul has already acknowledged an idol is nothing in the world in chapter 8. Does he now say that idols are actually demons? No, but he does say demonic spirits take advantage of idol worship to deceive and enslave people. Without knowing it, idol worshipers are glorifying demons in their sacrifice. I just want to make that more clear. The one is chapter 8 is talking about the idol just as an idol can't hurt you. The food you eat can't hurt you. But this chapter 10 is now looking at it from a spiritual angle. Looking at it from a spiritual angle, though it's offered to an idol, which you know means nothing, but really behind the scenes, you're either giving it to God or you're giving it to demons. And so he says, you cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. When Paul speaks of the Lord's table, he uses the term to contrast with tables used for pagan idol meals. An ancient invitation to such a meal reads, Sermon invites you to a meal at the table of the Lord Serapis in the temple of Serapis tomorrow, the 15th, from 9 o'clock onwards. If it means something to eat at the Lord's table, then it means something to eat at the table of demons. So, in other words, you can't, if you want to talk about eating the Last Supper, all right, and the communion food, okay, you can't be claiming to be one with Christ, and then as you go through, the eating of the bread and the drink, that it is to God and representing Jesus and his body and his shed blood. So when you eat communion at the table of the idols, you're actually joining up with demons. All right. Have used this passage to support the idea of the Mass as a sacrifice for sins. But it is reading far too much in the text to say that the Christian meal, communion, must be a sacrifice as it claimed in the Mass, because it is compared to the meal connected with pagan sacrifices and Jewish sacrifices. The emphasis and similarity regarding the meal, not the sacrifice. There may be two Corinthian ideas Paul wants to answer. The Corinthian Christians thought, since an idol is not real, it doesn't matter what we eat, and it doesn't matter where we eat it. Paul answers by agreeing the idol is in itself nothing in chapter 8, but now explains that demons are in the spiritual realm. When you offer it to idols, it's actually demons who are taking it. Don't say they take advantage, all right? It's just very clear. It's very clear there. When you take communion, that's at the Lord's table, you are becoming one with the Lord. So when you take this other, it's demons that are at the other end. They don't just take advantage, they are the ones receiving it, and you are literally joining with them and giving them advantage in your life. The Corinthian Christians thought, as long as we participate in the Lord's table, we are safe in him. Paul answers that they disgrace the Lord's table when they fellowship with idols. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? The unwitting fellowship of some of the Corinthian Christians with demons by participating in the dinners at the pagan temples will provoke the Lord to jealousy. He has a right over all our worship. He has a right to be offended if we give our fellowship to demons. It doesn't matter that the Corinthian Christians didn't intend to worship demons at these heathen feasts in pagan temples. If a man puts his hand into the fire It doesn't matter if he intends to burn himself or not. He is burned just the same. I like that. All right. You don't plan to hurt yourself when you put your hand in fire. But if you put it in fire, you're going to get burned. So the same. If a man dates a woman and they get serious about their relationship, what will happen if he takes up the same kind of relationship with another woman? What will the first woman think? The man cannot simply say, well, I still give attention to you. Are we stronger than he? The Corinthian Christians claimed the right to eat at pagan temples because they were such strong Christians. But are they stronger than God is? Back to the issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols. What about eating the same meat somewhere else? 23 and 24.
Verse 23. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no one seek his own, but every man's another's wealth.
Yeah. All right. All things don't edify. All right. Edify means to build up spiritually. So we're not supposed to be doing things just to please ourselves, but whether or not they build us up spiritually. The Corinthian Christians focused on their own rights and knowledge only to ask one question: what's the harm to me? Instead of only asking that question, they needed also to ask, what good can this be for me? Just because something is permitted doesn't mean it is beneficial. The Christians did not seek the helpful things or the things that would edify. Essentially, instead of wanting to go forward with Jesus as much as they could, they wanted to know how much they could get away with and still be Christians. This is the wrong approach. I'm going to hold us over longer today. All right. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. As the Corinthian Christians asked the question, what's the harm to me? They did not consider how their actions harmed others. Just because something is fine for me does not mean I should do it. My own rights, or what I know to be permitted for myself, are not the standards by which I judge my behavior. I must consider what is the loving thing to do towards my brothers and sisters in Jesus. Verses 25 to 30.
Verses 25. Whosoever is so in the assemblies that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake.
Continue. You're going to read through verse 30.
Okay. But if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thy own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged for another man's conscience? Verse 30. For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that for which I give thanks?
How can Paul say this in light of what he said in 1 Corinthians 10:20-21? The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons. And I don't want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons, simply because the meat itself isn't infected by demons and can thus be eaten. Paul's warnings have to do with the atmosphere of fellowship with demons at the pagan temple, which is to be avoided, not the food itself. The sacrifices lost their religious character when sold in the meat market, so it was permitted to eat meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol at a private table. At the butcher shop, some of the meat was sacrificed to idols, some of it was not. Paul says, if you aren't going to partake of the atmosphere of the pagan temple, the meat itself doesn't matter. Don't even ask. It won't even bother you. This is directed toward those Corinthian Christians who had consciousness of the idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Paul says, don't even ask. What if one of the brothers with weak conscience objects, saying, wait a minute, that meat was sacrificed to an idol? Paul responds by quoting, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. The cow belonged to the Lord when it was on the hoof, and it belongs to the Lord now that is on the barbecue. The food isn't the issue. The idol worshiping atmosphere was the issue. This quotation from Psalms 24:1 was used as a Jewish blessing at mealtimes. Paul says it applies to this food also. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, eat what's set before you. If an unbeliever invites you to dinner, don't get into a debate about the meat with them. Don't ask, and it won't bother you. Notice that Paul does not prohibit socializing with non-Christians. He only prohibits the meal of fellowship at the pagan temples. If anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it. Here, Paul has in mind the setting where a Christian is warned about the food by his unbelieving host. With a sensitive conscience. In that case, it's clear the person thinks it's wrong for Christians to partake of meat sacrificed to idols, so don't eat it for the sake of conscience, not your own, but of the other one. But if I partake with thanks, that is, if I can eat with a clear conscience and offending no one else's conscience, why am I evil spoken of? Since the food itself is not the problem, no one should judge another Christian who can eat meat sacrificed to idols as long as they don't violate their own conscience or someone else's. It may seem that Paul is being inconsistent, but he is being very consistent according to one principle: liberty within the limits of love. 31 to 33, the concluding principle: do all to the glory of God.
Verse 31. Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. Verse 33. Even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved.
The purpose of our lives isn't to see how much we can get away with and still be Christians. Rather, it is to glorify God. If the Corinthian Christian would have kept this principle in mind from the beginning in this issue, how much easier it would have made everything.
Your food's in the microwave. Microwave your food.
Give no offense. An offense is an occasion to stumble, leading someone else into sin. Paul says none of our behavior should encourage another to sin. Paul is not talking about offending the legalism of others, something he was not shy about doing. Paul's desire regarding men was that they may be saved. More often than we think, low conduct in Christian living is connected to little regard for the lost. Paul's concern was not seeking his own profit, but that all may be saved. Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Thank you, Sister Catherine, for reading for us. And thank you, each and everyone, for coming out. I pray that these 8, 9, and 10 have made an impact on your lives. Remember, chapter 8 is talking about in knowledge. If it's just knowledge, there's nothing wrong, because we know idols are nothing. The food itself cannot injure us or harm us. But chapter 10 is showing us the spiritual implications of eating food in this community, the spiritual implications, that what's being offered in that communion thing is being offered to demons. And so once we understand that, it makes it easier for us not to do it. And we need to understand here that it isn't just knowledge, but it is knowledge and love, the love of souls and the love to give God all the glory, not to please yourself, but to please God in everything. When we, I think that part about the, do we make God jealous? If we understand about the offering to demons, it says, do we make God jealous? Yeah, God doesn't want us trying to do both, trying to be a Christian and keep communion in a Christian way, and yet, on the other hand, because of food, we want to be able to participate and have fellowship where we end up having fellowship with demons, because God is a jealous God and he wants all of our attention, all of our love, all of our obedience, all of our work and our actions to please him. He doesn't want it to please ourselves. We are saved. We have been bought with a price. We're not our own anymore. When we accept the Lord, we need to realize we're not to live to please ourselves. So let's just bow our heads now. Father, right now, I just pray that these 3 chapters will help us to better understand that we are to do things with the spiritual aspect in mind, not just do things with an outward show to please ourselves, but Lord, may we realize God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. To know the spiritual implications is so important, that when we eat food offered to idols, then we, Lord, are really entering into a realm where we are giving demons place and fellowshipping with demons and serving demons. Help us, Lord, to see the truth of it all and not just to look at it from the outward viewpoint. Thank you, Jesus. In thy wonderful name, may these chapters enlighten us and help us to see things clearly, understand things clearly, and do all to the glory of God, and that souls might be won to you. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen. So praise the Lord. We'll see you next Tuesday, hopefully, those that belong there, as we go back to Romans again. God is a good God, and I pray that the teaching has not confused you, but opened your eyes. Bye-bye.